Hi there, my name is Vasily Giannakeas. I'm a scientist here at Women's College Hospital Research and Innovation Institute. And today I'm going to talk to you about my paper. The rationale for conducting this study is we were interested in seeing whether bilateral mastectomy, what are the actual cancer outcomes in women that get a bilateral mastectomy. And so what I mean by cancer outcomes is seeing whether women will develop a contralateral breast cancer, so that's a second cancer in the opposite breast, and will women have a lower risk of death from breast cancer because you're actually avoiding a contralateral breast cancer in the opposite breast. And so that's really what our study was aiming to do, and we were essentially interested in comparing women that had a bilateral mastectomy or chose to have a bilateral mastectomy to women that chose to have a lumpectomy or a unilateral mastectomy. As expected, we found that women that had a bilateral mastectomy had a much lower risk of developing a contralateral breast cancer in the follow-up period as compared to women that had a lumpectomy. And so the risk of contralateral breast cancer in the lumpectomy group was roughly 8% in the 20 years after their original cancer, whereas the risk of contralateral breast cancer in the bilateral mastectomy group was less than 1%. So that was our first major finding. The second finding related to the risk of death from breast cancer after after you develop a contralateral breast cancer. So if you look at women that develop a contralateral breast cancer and follow them forward from that contralateral event, they have a much higher risk of dying from breast cancer as compared to women that never got a contralateral breast cancer. So the risk of death from breast cancer in women that developed a contralateral breast cancer was roughly 32% in the follow-up period, as compared to roughly 15% in women that never developed a contralateral breast cancer. So that was our second finding. The third finding relates to the original comparison groups between the bilateral mastectomy patients and the lumpectomy patients. If we follow them forward for breast cancer specific deaths, the number of deaths in both of those groups in the 20-year period was roughly the same. And so there were actually 15, out of the 36,000 women in each group, there were only 15 fewer deaths in the bilateral mastectomy group as compared to the lumpectomy group. So essentially what happened here is that we conducted roughly 36,000 bilateral mastectomies and prevented 15 deaths. So this is a surprising finding because clearly what we're seeing here is that preventing a contralateral breast cancer doesn't necessarily prevent breast cancer mortality. So what we originally thought was that contralateral breast cancers are new breast cancers that are independent of the first breast cancer, and therefore individuals that develop a second breast cancer in the contralateral breast should have a higher mortality rate, but that wasn't the case in our research. I think historically, and probably for a vast majority of researchers, a contralateral breast cancer is a completely independent random event that happens in the opposite breast that has nothing to do with the first breast cancer. And furthermore, I think the current standards are that we believe that the contralateral breast cancer has metastatic potential in that it has a potential to metastasize and therefore increase risk of death in these patients. What we see in our work is that in fact the contralateral breast cancer might just be completely correlated with the first breast cancer, and it's merely a marker of the aggressiveness of the first cancer. And the implications of that are that by removing the probability of getting a contralateral event, your survival should theoretically be the same. And that's what we saw. So it has major implications in terms of our understandings of how breast cancer behaves, what our beliefs are in terms of how cancer spreads. So I think this work really builds on the evidence and accuracy of risk of breast cancer events after they develop the first breast cancer, right? And so what I mean by risks is risk of contralateral breast cancer and risk of death from breast cancer. So perhaps I'll give you a personal example. My mother, several years ago, was diagnosed with an early stage breast cancer and actually opted to get a bilateral mastectomy. So at the time of her diagnoses, I sat down with her and discussed what I thought her risks were in terms of developing a contralateral breast cancer and her risks of dying from breast cancer. Now, ultimately, her choice was to get a bilateral mastectomy. And I think what really drove that decision was because we had a strong family history of breast cancer, and she did not want to experience any additional cancer events that occurred that would potentially occur in the future. So even though I was quite convinced that her risk of death would be the same whether she got a lumpectomy or a bilateral mastectomy, she chose to get a bilateral mastectomy. And so I think I'm hoping that this research going forward will help provide risk estimates for these patients, and so doctors can actually use these risks and help inform patients on their risk of contralateral breast cancer over a certain time period and their risk of death from breast cancer over their time period. And in particular, those risks as a function of whether they receive a bilateral mastectomy, lumpectomy, or unilateral mastectomy. Women that are diagnosed with a breast cancer are often screened annually for contralateral breast cancers after their first breast cancer. And the rationale for that is you would want to find the contralateral breast cancer early, and it would be diagnosed at an earlier stage and presumably should impact on survival. What we found with our research is that contralateral breast cancers had no impact on mortality, right? So by eliminating the risk of contralateral breast cancer, we didn't see a change in mortality. And therefore, we question the usefulness of mammography screening for patients that have a breast cancer. And so we'd be curious to look at the impact of screening for breast cancer after women have a first breast cancer and see whether that would impact their risk of mortality. According to the theory that we think, the contralateral breast cancer event has little to no metastatic potential in patients, but yet roughly 35% of patients will receive chemotherapy for their contralateral breast cancer. And so perhaps that chemotherapy is not necessary in those patients. So we could consider a study where we actually look at de-escalating chemotherapy in patients that do develop a contralateral breast cancer.